Hello everyone from Arkan University of Creative Arts and Design. We are in Innovative Approaches and Communication course. I am the lecturer of this course. I am moderating and facilitating it every week. I would like to mention a bit about the aim of this course. This course, its aim is to bring different perspectives for our students by inviting people who have different professionals. And today we have a very precious guest. She is connecting from Northern Ireland, Leona O'Neill. She's a former journalist, worked for the Belfast Telegraph and Irish News, recently columnist at Irish News and working as an academic at Ulster University in Northern Ireland. Hello, Leona. How are you?
Hello, Harry. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being with us today.
Great to be here. Great to see you all.
Before giving the floor to you, I would like to read your short biography to our students to gain some information about you, and then I will give the floor to you.
Great.
Leona O'Neill is a former news reporter from Ireland, working with national newspapers such as the Belfast Telegraph and the Irish News. She covered life in Northern Ireland for over 25 years as one of the region's most established journalists. She is currently head of undergraduate journalism at Ulster University, a world-renowned institution delivering the region's only journalism degree and master's program. She also works as a weekly newspaper columnist for the Irish News and a field producer for the likes of Vice News, Al Jazeera, ABC, CBC, and other international media outlets. In 2019, she witnessed the murder of her journalistic colleague Lyra McKee at a riot in Derry, and in the aftermath was targeted by conspiracy theorists and other malicious groups in person and online. These traumatic experiences left her with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, trying to find hope, light, and positivity in a hugely negative experience. She left the newsroom for academia, focused her attention on bettering mental health in our media outlets and training young journalists on resilience and protecting their mental health in the challenging newsroom environment. She has spoken on the world stage about her own experience and on the importance of recognizing that journalists are first and foremost human beings, not robots, incapable of being impacted by the traumatic incidents that they cover. She was asked to do a TED Talk on the topic at Stormont, the Northern Ireland seat of government, to mark 25 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement and peace accords. She has worked tirelessly to elevate the conversation around newsroom mental health. She has written a book called Breaking Trauma in the Newsroom, which figures the stories of dozens of media workers impacted by trauma, both in local newsroom and war zones. She has written and contributed to journalism safety strategies for the National Council for the Training of Journalists and Reach PLC in the UK. She has given guest lecturer on the issue of newsroom trauma, resilience, and the importance of self-care and newsroom support at universities and media outlets across the UK. She developed and delivered the first newsroom mental health symposium, Media Strong, in Northern Ireland in May 2023, bringing together experts from the fields of media and health to discuss strategies to help support media workers. She is currently undertaking a PhD in journalism and trauma and is developing a newsroom well-being program alongside Northern Ireland Health Trust clinical psychologists that will help change the traditionally toxic mindset in newsroom and improve and nurture good mental health in our media workers, which is very inspiring biography. And now she is will be discussing journalism and resilience. The floor is yours, Leona.
Thank you, Harry. Yes, so I'm Leona O'Neill. I don't know if we could get the slides up there, or if you want to see. Maybe I'll let you. Okay, we'll put the slides up first. This is me. This is Leona O'Neill. I've been a journalist in Northern Ireland, and I'm very conscious of speaking too fast in case English is not your first language, but because I tend to speak really quickly. We do that here in Ireland. We speak quite quickly. I've been a journalist in Northern Ireland for 25 years, over 25 years, and I've covered all aspects of life here in this corner of the world during that time. I don't know if you guys are studying history or anything like that. We had really bad violence and conflict here for over 30 years, from the 1960s up until 1998, when we had the IRA called a ceasefire, and things have been pretty okay since then. We've had some blips in the road, but it wasn't the type of violence that we had when I was growing up. And I just went into journalism just as the peace was breaking out, I suppose. And but there was still a lot of conflict there. So I've covered in my time as a journalist peace and violence and politics and presidents and quirky Northern Irish life and love and laughter and ups and downs and peace and violence, the good days and the bad days. And there have been many of both. And it has been a bit of a roller coaster as a journalist in Northern Ireland. A lot of the news organisations would send their journalists, particularly in the UK, send their journalists over here to us in Northern Ireland to get their hostile environment training on our streets because of the war situation that was happening here at the time. So I worked, as Huri said there, I worked for the Belfast Telegraph for many of those years, and I was a hard news reporter. I was also a magazine reporter and all different types of features reporters and columnists and whatnot. But as a hard news reporter, anything dramatic that was happening, anything kind of, breaking the hard stories like you would see up at the top of a news report or you would see on the front pages of a newspaper, then that was the type of stuff that I was covering. I was there front row watching history unfold, or at rallies absorbing the atmosphere, or at the riots with petrol bombs flying over, arcing over my head. I had no fear whatsoever. I loved all of that type of thing. I was a very well-established journalist. I worked as a field producer, and I still do, for Vice News and Al Jazeera and CBC and ABC and a lot of other international news organisations who want an insight into Northern Ireland. They contact me, and I get the stories organised for them. So I was on the radio, I was on the television, I literally had no fear whatsoever in speaking at anything. But then my life changed and my career changed. One dark and cold night in my home city, I was covering a riot, and the person standing just feet from me was shot in the head by a terrorist gunman. So can I get the next slide there, please? So I see my slide has, that's my formatted wrong. So the G should be up on the top line there. But what I wanted to say was that nothing ever feels light again. Whenever you see someone murdered, nothing feels the same again. It's witnessing the worst side of humanity, and it's a thing that not a lot of people get to experience. Thankfully, not a lot of people get to experience. But when you do experience something like that, a life experience like that, it's really hard to see the good side of life again. And I felt that for such a long time, and I still do sometimes. Whenever you see something like that, it's almost like a spectre follows you around. You're a human being, and this awful thing has happened in front of you, and it's like a spectre or a cloud or something follows you around ceaselessly. And a lot of people, thankfully, as I say, don't know what that horror feels like. Human beings cannot witness something as brutal as that and just get on with life. It just leaves a stain on your soul. And that's just not me. That's, a lot of journalists who are working in the field, they see things, they're human beings, and things just land on them for whatever reason, for psychological reasons, for whatever, maybe people can relate to something, or someone is the same age as someone they love, or whatever it is, and that's not appreciated enough. I don't think in society that journalists deal with a lot of really heavy stuff a lot of the time. Can I get the next slide there, please? So this is Lyra McKee, and I didn't know Lyra McKee well at all. We had spoken maybe once just in passing, but we were practically strangers. But our worlds collided that night in Creggan. It was 5 years ago now during a riot, and it was Easter Thursday. It was around this time of year, and I was there covering violence surrounding a march, a contested march, a march that had a lot of controversy surrounding it. The police had banned it, and the march organisers said they were going to go ahead with it. So there's a lot of tension around that. And on the Thursday night before the march, on the Sunday, I think it was, rioting broke out in a housing estate there called Creggan. And the Creggan estate, if I could paint a picture in your head, this is a huge housing estate overlooking Derry, which is the second biggest city in Northern Ireland. And it's a lovely place. It's a place where families live side by side. There are also murals of gunmen on the wall in some areas, and in other places, beautiful murals of children laughing and colourful things are on the walls as well. It's a really well-loved area. People take really good care of their houses and the gardens, and they're a proud people. But terror organisations like Dissident Republicans, those are hung over from the Troubles. They still have a real grip on that community, unfortunately. And that night, rioting broke out. So it's broke out, if you can picture the scene, it's broke out in the middle of a housing estate. These are people's homes. It's broken out on their doorsteps, basically. And that night, I was working as a reporter. I got news that there was rioting broken out, and I went up to that area, and I stood and I took videos, and I stood up against walls, and I know to take cover. I know my hostile environment training. And I stood up against walls, and I filed my stories to Belfast as it happened, because that was the main story that night, that this riot, it was quite bad riot, and they had burned vehicles at the bottom of the street to kind of trap the police in, and it was quite intense riot. And so, but looking around me in that area, and I've covered riots for 20 years in Northern Ireland, and this is normally the way that it happens. People are standing in groups talking. It's not a fearful situation. There were teenagers taking selfies of the burning cars, beside the burning cars. Women stood there with their children, holding their children on their hip, and none of us knew what that night would bring, the horrors that it would bring, and the death, and how it would change so many lives. But it was a really rough night. Rioters had been firing fireworks and petrol bombs at police vehicles at this stage for a few hours, and red flashes were lighting up the night sky in people's faces. And it was like some manner of weird festival, and it was almost like a jovial atmosphere. It's very difficult to describe unless you're from here what I mean by that, because young people get involved in these riots and they don't see the danger, and other people are just standing around as if it's completely normal. But at 11 o'clock that night, I heard shots ring out, and I knew immediately, I've covered enough of this stuff, I knew immediately it was gunfire, and I ran. I hunched over. I ran up the street for hard cover, and I heard bullets whizzing past my head as I ran, and I shouted at other people to take cover, but nobody was taking this seriously. And they, you know, the ordinary people were just standing around, and I remember a man laughing, saying, you know, what are you talking about? Nobody would fire a gun up the street at a crowd of people. But they did. It was unbelievable to them that a gunman would do such a thing. But the laughter died out when someone saw a woman on the ground and she'd been hit in the head, and that was poor Lyra. And people were screaming and wailing and panicking. It was total chaos. And myself and my friend tried to help, and it was just it was awful. It was the awful experience. Next slide there. So the next life was ended. Then a life was ended, and our lives would never ever be the same. And for me, you know, the next couple of days were a blur. I worked in the news, and this was a news story. And even though I had seen the most horrific thing that I would never wish on anybody to see with their own eyes the night before, I had to go to work the next day, and I was in complete shock. I'd never seen anything like that before. It was awful. It was painful. It was traumatic. But I was standing at a vigil, or I was standing where she fell with a TV crew, and I was completely numb. I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know where I wasn't. Obviously, I didn't sleep. I couldn't get the images that I saw the night before out of my head. I was I was on an autopilot. My mouth was working independently from my brain. I was standing at her funeral. I was numb. I was at work. I was numb. I was trying to sleep. I was trying to be normal, but I could not be normal. You cannot be normal after seeing something like that. It was horrific. Next slide there, please. So sorry, all my slides seem to have formatted in a weird way there when we were carrying them across, but next, the harassment came, and a lot of journalists have to suffer this. It's not just something that's solely, you know, exclusive to me. A lot of journalists face online abuse, and mine was online and in person, and so. But the harassment arrived like a tsunami. Conspiracy theories picked up on this, as they do with a lot of things, and you'll know this from doing communication. Conspiracy theories pick up on things that are worldwide events, and they picked at it, and they said that it was a false flag. They said that we were all actors, and they picked on me because I was a well-known journalist, and I had covered the story, and that I was there. And earlier in that day, before I had gone to the riot, I'd interviewed Nancy Pelosi, who was the House of Representatives leader, I think, at the time. She's a US politician. And I had been standing beside Lyra that night. And these conspiracy theorists, someone with hundreds of thousands of views picked up on this and made a video that I was in the Illuminati, and that I had Lyra murdered as a sacrifice to Nancy Pelosi. And I thought, nobody is going to believe this absolute nonsense. And I let it go. I had to just switch off social media completely, because people were saying, people were just picking over the pieces of this as if it was kind of something normal, or a story, or something in a TV show or something, but it was real people's lives, and I just couldn't handle looking at it. But yeah, someone did that, and then that was picked up by hundreds of thousands more, and then homegrown conspiracy theorists here in Northern Ireland, they started saying that I was a liar, that it was a false flag, that we were actors, that I was hiding her. Someone said that I was hiding her, and I need to give her back to her family, and they called for me to be arrested, and there was a whole thing about this on social media. There was calls for me to be hunted down. My address was shared. But I still thought, no one will believe this but they did, and they did in their thousands. And the death threats that I got, and that my children were contacted and by people, and my house was under threat, and I was under threat, and people were messaging me telling me they were going to slit my throat or they were going to kill me like I killed Lyra, and it was insanity. And there were so many pylons that I couldn't even keep up with them. And the abuse, I was getting stuff sent to my house. I was getting emailed stuff on my work email, and messaged, and telephone, text messages, all that stuff. People talked about how I lied then about being there, that I wasn't really there, and that I was just doing this to further my career. And then locals connected to the murder, then they joined in the game, the sport, I suppose, of harassing me. And graffiti was sprayed on the walls, like this one here, that I was trying to discredit me, that I was a government tout, or that I was a police informer, and that I would do anything for a story. And there was a lot of moves to silence me, to shut me up. There were threats online, there were threats in person, and I was sent emails from people saying not to go into certain areas. I was a reporter, I had to go into all areas, not to go into certain areas because I would be attacked. Other people asking me how my PTSD was, and if I killed myself yet. And it was really cruel, coming on top of witnessing something absolutely brutal that already broke me. It was relentless, and it was really, really horrible. Can I have the next slide there, please? So I developed PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it wasn't the PTSD that you see in the Hollywood films where the soldiers, you know, they take flashbacks, or they hallucinate, or anything like that. I had the night terrors and the anxiety and the hypervigilant, and I'd wake my husband up in the middle of the night gasping for air and panicking, and I was ceaselessly afraid. If you can imagine a person getting not even hundreds, thousands of messages, or being spoken about in forums about people raised money to buy weapons to come and attack my house because they thought that I had something to do with the disappearance of Lyra McKee, that I was hiding her, myself and other people. The stuff that people believed was insane. But when you're facing that type, and a lot of journalists have this, when you're facing that type of hate every single day, you think everyone hates you. It's just the way that a human mind responds to such hostility. And I was ceaselessly afraid. I saw only the negative side of life. Everything was frightening all of a sudden. For someone who has for 25 years walked into every type of situation with no fear whatsoever, I prided myself on my courage and my bravery to do the hard stories and to speak to the tough people. And my courage leaving me was really, really hard. It was really tough. So I struggled through the next year in lockdown. I didn't realize I had PTSD at this time. We were in lockdown. But I got COVID at the very start of lockdown, and I had spent a year running away. You know what people do whenever maybe they're traumatized by things, run away from the thing that is traumatizing you. COVID made me have to isolate in a room for 2 weeks, and I looked at myself and thought, you know what, I can't run from this anymore. I couldn't find peace on my streets, so I burnt my 25-year career to the ground, and I started again in teaching. So next slide, please. So what I found whenever I was going through this journey, still didn't know it was PTSD. I was just reaching out to other journalists, and other journalists had seen the abuse that I was getting online and said, you know, this is awful and I hope you're okay. And this happened to me, and you know, I did this, and sharing experiences. I was really grateful for them to do that and sharing their stories and about how they broke the news and how the news broke them. And there were so many of them from all over the world, because this poor girl's death was a worldwide story. And they told me about inquests and tragedies and war zones and hospital wards and riots and how they'd been damaged by what they had seen. And I knew then I'm not the only person. I'm not this unique exclusive person that has seen something horrible and it has just broken them as a human being. There are other people out there as well, and it's quite common in our industry, in the journalism media industry, for this to happen to people. And why is it such a secret? But they made me feel less alone, and and they made me also seek help. Next slide there, please. So I went to counselling because a lot of these other journalists said, listen, I went to counselling and it helped me immensely. And I went back to counselling, and sometimes I still go back to counselling. But I still couldn't talk about what happened without getting so upset, because it wasn't only the incident itself, it was the aftermath of that, and then it was bringing in my children to it and the things that are precious to me. My home was no longer safe. I felt my children were no longer safe. So there's a lot of dimensions to that entire thing. There was a lot of ripple effects from that incident. But I did CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, there about, it was a year ago, or probably more than a year ago now, actually. And it gave me my voice back, and it gave me my courage back. And I thought during that, that I would look through my career and the stories that I had covered and how they landed on me. And I realized it wasn't just the one event. It was many tragedies built up and unprocessed trauma in the newsroom, because I was a journalist in Northern Ireland, and I had covered so many stories of people who had been murdered, the aftermath with their families, and all those stories I didn't realize landed on me for various reasons. Maybe someone was the same age as me who was murdered. Maybe someone reminded me of my father. Maybe someone reminded me of my son. But I noticed during that year that I didn't notice that I had PTSD, that a lot of those stories were coming back to haunt me and kind of follow me around, and it was pretty awful. Next slide, please. So what I really wanted to kind of get across today actually is that newsrooms traditionally are very macho places. There is no room for weakness in newsrooms. It's a little different now, but we use language like tough and hard-nosed and brave and resilient to talk about our media workers, and we send them into like war zones and the worst places imaginable. Ones revolving around tragedy and hostility and everything else, the worst side of humanity, just in witnessing that every single day. And we expect them to come out undamaged, like they are superhuman, or they are robots, or they are incapable of having normal human reactions. And they're given very little support after this. They're expected to go on to the next story, and it can be a real grim conveyor belt of doom for many. And it does break some. There are so many high incidents of alcoholism in newsrooms, in drugs, using prescription drugs or other drugs, or using things as crutches, and seeking out dangerous and damaging behavior as well, also a trauma response. So I wanted to do something about that. Can I have the next slide there, please? So whenever I couldn't sleep, because that was one of the symptoms I had with PTSD, I couldn't sleep. I had awful nightmares for years. It's been 5 years now, and I still have some nightmares. But in these nights, in the dark of the night, when I couldn't sleep, I decided that what happened to me and what happened, my experience in sort of dealing with something very, very traumatic, it couldn't be for nothing, that I needed to change newsrooms, because at this stage I was actually working in a university training young journalists to be journalists, and I needed those environments that they were going into to be safe and to be nurturing and to look after them, and not be as rough perhaps as some of the newsrooms that I moved through when I was a journalist. So I said that I'm going to shout about newsroom mental health, whether people want to hear it or not, and try and change the mindsets, one person at a time even, and make everyone hear this conversation about newsroom mental health. Because too many of our journalists have been damaged, not by the job, but the mindset that they shouldn't be affected. How dare you be affected? You're a journalist. You cannot let what has happened. You're not the story. You can't let what's happening out there impact you. Some are living with awful mental health, and they're relying, as I say, on drugs and alcohol for crutches and leaning on the dangerous behavior because they are damaged, because they have been damaged by the job, because they have been damaged by the things that they have seen on a daily basis. This isn't people going into war zones. These are people who are perhaps going into war zones. Of course, you're going to be damaged by that, but here at home, in local newspapers, in your local newspaper, journalists have to deal with court cases, perhaps involving people who, someone who's murdered a baby, or someone who's murdered their wife, or someone who's murdered their husband, or awful car crashes, tragedies, families losing everything, inquests, and the awful deaths. And that's every week. That's not just every so often. There's a lot of really, really traumatic stories that we have to cover. Can I have the next slide there, please? So this is my book. This is Breaking Trauma in the Newsroom with Chris Lindsay, and I gathered together. You have to realize that journalists don't speak about these things. They do not speak about their own mental well-being or how things damage them. And to get, I think there are 16 or 17 journalists together to talk about the stories that broke them in this was groundbreaking, because, and they're very well-known, well-established journalists, and they spoke about the stories that landed on them, that left a mark, that had them crying at the side of the road and tore at their soul, that broke them. And they showed their vulnerability so that other journalists could read this and go, well, I feel less alone. Like those people, if we go back 5 or 10 minutes ago there when I was talking about people who reached out to me at that time, and I felt less alone and it made me feel better. That's what I wanted to do with this. And people have read this book all over the world, and they've contacted me and say, I thank you for writing this, because I have been broken by such and such, and I thought I was the only person. And this book tells them that they're not. So they showed their vulnerabilities, but this was not a weakness thing. This was a strength thing. This was courage. For too long, people in the media industry have had to hide the fact that they're struggling because of this toxic mindset. For too long, our media workers have been disregarded. They've been dehumanized. They've been torn down on social media. They've been told that they're not worthy of our care and sympathy. And you can still see that in today's society. You can still see it with people like Donald Trump standing up and telling people that the media are the enemy of the people, or people being derogatory, or some of these conspiracy theorists or YouTube journalists or whatever. They do the same thing. They try and dehumanize our media, that they are trying to lie to us, that they are liars, they are doing this and that. So you can still see that. Next slide, please. So I always try and explain this to people who are not journalists about what challenges journalists can face sometimes. So that feeling when you read horrific stories, or you read something horrific about a child being killed, or awful tragedies that befall people, and that raw, gnawing feeling of helplessness that you feel, and that's just you reading it. Imagine the person that has to collate that information, that has to stand in front of the person who lost and record those emotions, look them in the eye and see the tears falling down their face, listen to the grim details, and then filter it, because some of the stuff that we hear as journalists cannot be put into newspapers or media outlets, because it's just too graphic, or it's just too grim, or it's just too horrible. So sometimes we have to leave out the horrible parts and not broadcast them. Journalists have to stand with the bereaved and the bereft and absorb all this pain and take responsibility also for telling that story in a responsible way, to carry that home with them. Can you imagine doing that several times a week in your home city, or far from home, away from anything that's soft or beautiful or warm or comforting to you? And then coming back to a newsroom where you're expected to get on with things, like you just haven't seen someone's world completely collapsing, or you haven't just been standing at a murder scene or heard the most harrowing details of a murder case, because that's what journalists do. You know, I've been out at murder scenes and the most horrific details in front of you, and then have to go home and make dinner for my children. And it's almost like you have to switch off from one thing to the next, and that's not a normal thing either. Can I have the next slide there, please? So our newsrooms are really broken. They across the world. It's not just a thing that's exclusive to Northern Ireland. They can be toxic and they can be dangerous places. They are often fueled by adrenaline and coffee and deadlines, and those within them have to deal with all of that, plus hostility on the street, plus abuse online. You saw there some of the online abuse that I got, and multiply that by 10, and it's every journalist get that. If you have a social media presence at all, you're getting abuse online from people who are calling you a liar, or you're calling you biased, or telling you that you're awful at your job, all that type of thing. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be as toxic. Humanizing our reporters will help stop that. And if you are guilty of that yourself, if you're guilty of looking at a journalist and thinking they are a liar, they don't tell the truth, or and not listening perhaps to what they are saying, then maybe this might make you think. But in newsrooms themselves, people work best when they feel supported, and they shouldn't have to hide their struggle, because people do hide their struggle, because the job is to go out to the hard stories, to go out to the tough places, and to tell those stories. And so many journalists are afraid to say, I'm struggling with this, or this story really broke me, because they'll be taken off those stories and they'll be put on something gentler, or they'll be taken away. They can't handle it anymore. They'll be told to, as you know, I was told to, if you can't stick it, then go do something else, or you're made to feel less if you are struggling with something. So journalists are people too. They have feelings and they have families, and they often disregard their own emotional well-being, like they don't believe this emotional toll will impact on them. And that's quite sad. I think that they think of themselves, the newsroom thinks of them as tough and hard-nosed. They think that of themselves also, and they beat themselves up if they are struggling with something. It's a really weird, warped kind of world that we live in. But throughout, can I have the next slide actually, please? Next slide. So through this journey, I've had to learn to be resilient again. Before this happened, I was really resilient. I was tough. I was hard-nosed, and then just something broke through that wall, and that's what it was. But I've had to learn to be resilient again, because I had to. Sometimes we have to take the darkness of the night and fight it with everything we have to seek out the light. And every single wound and scar is reason enough to show the world, with just hope and determination, you can rise from anything. And that transcends to anything that happens in life. But in being resilient, it's not just being strong. I had to be vulnerable. I had to be open to healing. I had to hold no shame. I had to be strong. I had to bring my courage back. I had to take my life experience, which wasn't, no matter how bad it was, and I had to use that as fuel to try and make things better for others. They say that it's in the tough times that you find yourself, and I've been through a bit of a storm, and even when that was raging all around me, I could still hear my calling, and it was to help people understand journalists and newsrooms and the toxicity that can make that very difficult world to navigate. And that's where I found my courage. That's where I found my why. That's where I found my reason to get up in the morning when I didn't sleep the night before because of nightmares or whatever. And that's how I kept going. I kept moving forward, no matter how difficult. Sometimes the steps were quite heavy, but I still kept moving forward. But I now concern myself with teaching young journalists the trade, not only the trade, but how to look after your physical and psychological safety as well, which is just as important. I'm trying to work to make the newsrooms that my young journalists go into more caring and more nurturing, because resilience isn't just about being strong. It's about knowing that we are human and that we will have normal human responses to traumatic things. It's about talking about that and seeking help when we need it. That's what resilience is in my eyes. People might think it's something different. You can't protect yourself against things that come at you fast in the middle of the night in Craigan or wherever, but you can fight back against that traditional mentality that tells you that you shouldn't be impacted by that you are a robot that has no feelings. Because trauma isn't a weakness, it's a humanness. That's what I always think. And courage is recognizing that in yourself and in others and working to normalize the conversation around newsroom mental health. So that is me finished talking. And if anybody has any questions about any of that, feel free to shout. I was going to show you the beautiful view from my window in Ulster here, and I was telling Huri that the sun was shining and it was beautiful. But now we have grey skies. Huri, I think you've cursed me from afar. But let me show you anyway. Let me show you this beautiful, and you can think of the questions that you might want to ask me. But this is my. This is a view from my university window. I don't know if can you see that? Can you see it okay?
Yes, it is great.
Yeah.
What is the name of the river?
That is the River Foyle in Derry, and it's honestly the sun was shining 5 minutes ago, but we've got some grey skies.
The weather is very hot in Cyprus right now. I'm sorry about because of saying this, but
but go ahead if anybody has any questions, if they want to
yes,
ask.
there is a question. I think. Yep. 1 second.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very thought-provoking, to say the least. I had quite a troubling question. You said how, to some extent, certain events that you're reporting things on, they have to be censored due to too many graphic details being present, or due to certain grim aspects of said events. Don't you think that, I mean, censorship is present in every single country around the world, and I guess it's present for us to be protected by newsrooms and news anchors. But having these graphic details left out, and these grim interviews that you have to take through and through every single time something awful happens in your area. I mean, we as individuals have already been desensitized to a lot of the news that we see on screen and in newspapers, but having to add these moments and details that might be traumatic to us is actually going to benefit us more rather than having them taken out of the story. Do you see what I mean? Like having them left out is serving no positive purpose besides the government's thinking that thus far all the censorships that they've posed onto newsrooms, they've been for our protection. We as a new generation no longer watch the news the same way, and we want to know the details so that we know what not to do. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I get you. So it's not censorship. So a lot of the time, perhaps, say for example, it's a story about how a person was killed, or the graphic details of that. Inquests, for example, inquests have photographs of dead bodies and what has happened to people when they were murdered, for example. None of that is going on the newspaper, because newspapers are being could be read by young people, could be read by children, not young people. So it's not censorship. We don't take facts. The facts are there. The facts are going into the media outlet. That's not what the question is. But things like what I'm saying is of the photographs of maybe people who have been killed. Those are not going to be. Those have to be filtered. Or some of the more, maybe graphic wasn't the right word to use, but some of we go in and interview someone for maybe an hour or 2 hours, and then they only get 3 minutes on a news segment. So we have to absorb all the grief and the heartache and all of those things ourselves while we're interviewing them, but all of that stuff, all of the words that they say cannot go into a 3-minute news piece. So we have to filter things in that way as well. But we're absorbing everything, the entire situation. You're sitting in someone's house and they're talking about how their husband was murdered, how they were blown up by the IRA, for example, and all the graphic details that are surrounding that. You have to be sensitive to people. You have to be sensitive to people's families. You have to be sensitive to maybe their children or their grandchildren. So you don't want to be put on every single graphic detail, because then you'd be accused of sensationalism as well. So there are a whole lot of different dimensions to that, but it's 100% not censorship. If the details have to be in the news story, then they will be in there. For example, if someone died suddenly and it turned out that it was they had taken their own lives, then you don't put in the details of how they died, because that then our guidelines and our rules and with regards to integrity and morals, and the Samaritans. I don't know if you have the Samaritans over there in Cyprus, but the Samaritan guidelines tell us not to use the method of someone committing suicide, because it encourages other people to commit suicide in the same way. So there's a lot of different dimensions to each story, is completely unique in itself as well. It's not censorship though, it's just being sensitive to what people maybe are, the readers or the viewers. Or I'm trying to think of a couple of examples. There was for example, there was one night when I was working in Belfast, and a photographer came down and said that there had been a shooting, someone had been murdered, and he went and got photographs, and he came back with the photographs, and the photographs showed the man very clearly at the wheel of his car, shot in the head, slumped over his car, his face was seen. And I didn't use that photograph, because if someone I knew was killed, would I want to see that splashed all over the news for Evermore Amen, in a time that man had been, his name had been mentioned, because he was quite a well-known person. So there's things like that. That's what I mean by filtering. It's not censorship. You don't need to see a photograph of a man with a, very badly injured and dead at the front of his, and driving his car. So that's what I mean by filtered. It's not, we're not the gatekeepers to facts. We put the facts out there, but there are some stuff that is not for public consumption, that would be traumatizing to people, that would be that type of thing. Hope that answers your question.
I get that. A couple of things that you said, I got them confused. That's why. Sorry for using the term censorship. That's not exactly what I meant, but you said so yourself, how people and humans in general are prone to getting trauma in one way or another, and having to escape this and not see trauma for what it is around us is what's causing all of these problems, in my opinion. I don't know if you agree with that. And it is a responsibility of a journalist and a reporter, together with the freedom of press, to say to people what it is like to go through this trauma, even in a very brief moment, for you to add these details, although might inconvenient those who have got to experience this traumatic event firsthand, it might benefit the future generations and the people who live in that area, at least, to look at what they do and be more thoughtful and careful as to what to act or not to act upon. I hope I've explained myself a little clearer this time.
You did. Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, by the way. That was a brilliant answer. Yes, Miss, do you have anything to ask?
There is another question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And first of all, I want to apologize for what you had to go through over the course of your life. I mean, things happen, but sometimes it's just a little bit too much for the human mind. And I'm really happy that you've been able to get over most part of it. So my question is, in our everyday life, we tend to receive news one way or the other. We get to hear from different news outlets one way or the other. Mainly, I don't really watch the traditional media mostly, which is on TV most of the time. But
Yeah.
I mostly get my news from the internet, mostly on Twitter, because I mean, those traditional media outlets also post on Twitter, so like the news is also there. And then there are independent journalists all around the world that just do things and then post
Yeah.
information. So my question is about the traditional media outlets.
Yeah.
In some part of the world, there are ideas that the traditional media outlets are being bought by the government to, you know, pass narratives down to the people, to like not give like the clear understanding of what exactly is going on.
Yeah.
And I'll give an example. I'm Nigerian. So I think last year we had an election in Nigeria, and then they elected a new government and everything.
Yeah.
So a lot of things have been going on and a lot of things have been happening. And sometimes there's this independent journalist I follow on Twitter. He's Nigerian as well. He gives the news, and sometimes he like gives a particular news, and then you expect, okay, this is a serious matter, and you're obviously the traditional media outlet is going to pick it up at some point. But then again, you keep waiting and waiting, and the traditional media outlet don't post it, because like I'm then trying to like communicate with my family back home, and I'm like, oh, okay, I saw this on Twitter and actually it happened. What's going on? Are you guys safe? Whatever. And they're like, oh, I haven't seen it yet. It's not on the news yet. We're not getting it yet. So my question is, how do we pass information through the traditional media outlets so that not everybody's on social media, not everybody can get the news from alternative sources? And I know journalism is an amazing work. It's like journalists put in a lot of work into getting information and into like preparing news for
Yeah.
the consumers. But how do we get past the whole infrastructure and the whole government limitations in terms of how we receive news and how it is being passed through the traditional media?
So I'm not familiar with the media in Nigeria, unfortunately, but I can speak for the media here. I will not speak for them, but speak to the media here. people say that the government are in control of the media, but any media organization I've ever worked with, it's never been, you don't get an email from the government to say you have to cover this story like this or whatever. The journalist is given free rein to cover it whatever way they want. A lot of independent media who push themselves out as independent media, that they're not controlled by the corporations or government, are pushing themselves in that way. I'm not saying it's a guy that you follow. Is he a professional journalist? Is he a former journalist?
Yeah, he is a professional journalist.
So a lot of them here, I'm not saying the guy you follow does this, but a lot of them here push themselves as independent media, and that only they can get the stories and only they can get to the bottom of what's happening, or only they can do that. And I suppose they do that for follows. I don't know if I'm not saying the guy that you follow does this, but a lot of them here are not journalists, and they are putting themselves out there as journalists to get follows and likes on social media, perhaps. And also they're not controlled by the constraints that with regards legal stuff or law stuff or morals and ethics, that the journalists have to stick by these codes of conduct before they print anything. And a lot of the independent ones that are just on YouTube, they don't have to follow those very strict rules. So like, say if something, you say that guy said that something happened in Nigeria, say if that something happened here in the UK and an independent journalist was only commenting on it, and perhaps the BBC or someone looked into it and thought that it wasn't a story, or that it maybe has holes in it, or holes in it as in they couldn't stand the story up, or that the facts weren't right or something like that, they wouldn't touch it, they wouldn't go near that story. But independent journalists are free to do whatever they want with the story, perhaps, and people have got it wrong. I don't know if you have looked at the media, or sorry, not the media, but social media, and a lot of independent journalists in the last week or so, or 2 weeks, talking about Princess Catherine, that she was missing, and that there was, not mainstream media, but YouTube journalists and investigators were talking about how she hasn't been seen and all that type of stuff. So there are a lot of rules that you have to stick by to be a journalist, and there are a lot of kind of hoops that you have to jump through before you can get a story printed or published. And independent media don't have to do that, so they're free to write whatever they want, even if it's wrong, and they don't have to face the consequences that perhaps a journalist working for a larger organization would do. So I don't know if that answers your question. How do you get the information to the traditional media? Tag them in the post with the guy, and they look at it, and then if the story is worth covering, then they'll cover it. It's not like a lot of people talk about media blackouts, and which is nonsense. And in my opinion, I've been a journalist for 25 years. The only time I've ever heard of a media blackout was when the police told the media not to cover, and I didn't cover the story, it was a friend of mine, but not to cover a story because someone's been held hostage in a house, and they didn't want everybody gathering around the house because the person had a shotgun inside. And so they said, can you just hold off talking about this in the media for half an hour until we get the situation sorted out? There's no such thing as an email coming down from on high from the government telling editors, in my opinion and my experience in the places that I have worked in anyway, not to cover a story. And if it did, then you can guarantee that the people that were working in the organizations I work for would go after that story like a rabid dog because they've been told not to cover it. So it's easy to kind of say that the mainstream media are, again, we're discrediting them, we're dehumanizing them, we're calling them liars, we're saying that they don't cover stories that need to be covered. But you have to look at the agenda of people that are maybe doing that type of thing or saying that type of thing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it obviously gives me like a clear understanding of like how things work, because basically I think it's just a different walk of life, basically, because I've seen people in government where I'm from, and I've seen the way they operate, and I've seen the way they do things. So I just believe probably maybe it's like in a different work of life. But that it's really, I really understand from your perspective as well.
Yeah.
And perfect answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
Is there any other question? No? So this is my turn. Yes. Actually, yeah, let me check my... I'm very happy to hear that there's an awareness as well in Northern Ireland about the trauma, PTSD, for journalists, because my story is like this. Actually, when I decided to work on PTSD with journalists, because I'm an academic and I'm looking at journalism from psychological perspective, based on my background, psychology background, and let me put it here. And I realized that whenever we want, as a social media user, we can stop watching or reading, or we can refuse, following the news. But a journalist couldn't do it, because this is his or her job, and they have a responsibility for that. So the first point that I really wondered how they handle with it, how they cope with it, how they are influenced. What about their, resilience level when they are facing these kind of issues like daily crisis? Even the daily crises are influential as well. So, because as far as I understand from their own perspective, the feelings should leave their feelings out of the newsroom. So when I start to work on this, because of my close friends are now journalists, I realized that the awareness also increased about their emotions as well. And I would like to ask, what about the situation in Northern Ireland? When you started, it is very actually good as well to be aware of your own feelings and even sharing it. This is also very important, because it is inspiring. It is highlighting the importance of being aware of yourself, your feelings, because you are a human being first, and then you're a journalist or woman or mother. Anyway, so what about their attitudes in Northern Ireland? I mean, the journalist side.
Yeah, the attitudes. We're in a post-conflict situation in Northern Ireland, so we are the society. We were just talking about this before we came on air, but as a society, we're hugely traumatized by the conflict. A lot of us, and if maybe we don't experience the conflict, or if we didn't experience the conflict ourselves, there's a intergenerational thing there where things are passed down. So as a society, we're hugely traumatized. Journalists, for example, I ran the symposium here about newsroom mental health in Belfast, and I get a lot of pushback about that, about how can journalists be, from journalists themselves, how can journalists be traumatized? It's their job. If they don't like that type of thing, then they shouldn't have got into it. And a lot of things are said to me about that. So I ran the symposium in Belfast, and we had a good few people there. But I'm running it again now this summer in the UK, and there are 400 or 500 people already booked to come to it because they are really interested in it. And I wonder, is that a kind of symptom of Northern Ireland? Is kind of stiff upper lip, just get on with it. Don't, everybody's traumatized. What are you talking about your trauma for? What makes you so special? It's kind of that's a bit of the attitude. There's a lot of competitiveness. Well, that happened to you. Well, this happened to me and it was far worse. Or there's a lot of stuff whirling around there that can be quite difficult. And in one aspect, this is a kind of, in newsrooms, you'll never admit to struggling with anything. It's just the way that it is, because you're afraid. You're afraid that your editor will think that you're weak, will not send you out into these jobs, all those aspects are at play there, as well as being from Northern Ireland and expected to be tough. And so there's a lot of pushback there, but secretly or in my messages, journalists are messaging me saying, this happened to me 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I never got over it. I have tried, but I take prescription drugs, or I do dangerous activities, or whatever crutch that they use to kind of run away from their trauma. So it's still a very secretive thing. People are messaging me all the time, very well-known journalists from all over the UK, from all over the world, saying this is what happened to them and this is how they reacted, but they will not say it publicly. So that's why I'm saying it publicly, because I was a well-known journalist here, and I speak about these things, and I do get pushback. I get pushback from people. Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are talking about something like that? But it hasn't shut me up yet. So,
but I believe that if you work on it consistently, let's say, the awareness will be increasing, day by day. So,
well, it is. I mean, it is increasing day by day, and the conversation that I'm starting, if people are talking about it now, even if it's people saying, what is that girl on about? What is that woman on about with Newsroom mental health? Sure, we don't need that. Even if that starts a conversation, and then they start talking about things that maybe happened to them that kind of left them feeling awful, or that they had to drink a bottle of wine to get to sleep, and that's how they cope with it. It's starting a conversation, and me speaking about it and putting myself on some kind of a platform speaking about it makes other people talk about it as well, and that's making the conversation. It's normalizing the conversation, and it's like turning around a tanker at times, but it is making the conversation more normalized across the world. And that can only be a good thing. And there are so many groups and organizations now that are focusing on this, and that's a good thing as well.
Yeah, I have one more question. If you have,
of course.
Yeah, you mentioned about Macho Newsroom.
Yeah.
For example, in Cyprus, I can say that men are more famous. Men journalists are more famous than women journalists. I mean, by saying famous, they have more audiences than women. Unfortunately, I don't understand the reason. But what about in Northern Ireland? How do you see the situation in Northern Ireland?
Yeah. I mean, there are as many well-known female journalists as there are male journalists in Northern Ireland. There's some really fantastic female journalists here in Northern Ireland, really strong, feisty, fearless journalists. What I would say, though, with regards to that, is that female journalists get far more abuse than their male counterparts, and that's widely known. And I don't know why that is. Are they been attacked by men? I'm not sure, but I noticed when male journalists put a story up about something, and perhaps I put a story up about the same thing, this is when I was a journalist, I would get more abuse than the guys reporting on the same story. And perhaps it's because they think that we're easy targets, or that we're soft, or I don't know what it is, but the amount of, and obviously this abuse is coming from trolls and real misogynistic guys that think that women should be making tea and not making stories. So there's that as well. But the abuse, that's the difference that I see. But no, we have a lot of really fantastic female journalists here in Northern Ireland, really strong journalists, and I'm very proud of them for that as well, because it's a difficult sphere to exist in. It's a difficult job to navigate, and it's a difficult region to navigate as well. So it's fantastic that we have such strong, fearless female reporters here.
Yeah, it is same in Cyprus as well. We have so much, strong women journalists who are very well known as well. But when it comes to maybe the following or the audiences, I can observe that they, especially, for example, during the morning news, I can see that men are, listened or watching more than women. So I really wonder what the situation in Northern Ireland, but more or less similar, I think. Yeah, in
I
all
don't
around the
know.
world.
No, I think we're equal. I think men and women have equal airtime here. There's a lot of really, like, we've got Tara Mills on the radio. A lot of the shows have a male and a female presenter here. I noticed which is good. So no, we have there doesn't seem to be as many issues with regards to that. There are just as many really good female reporters as there are male ones here, getting as much airtime and getting as much kind of coverage.
Okay, do you have any questions? Okay, thank you so much. It was our pleasure for hosting you today. And thank you for sharing this enlightening information and your experiences with us. And I hope we will host you in person one day soon in the future.
I would love that. It would be sunnier than Derry. Yes, that would be lovely.
I suggest you to visit Cyprus during the summer, by the way.
Yes, summertime. Yeah, and I suggest Derry in the summertime also. It'll be less grey and less rainy. You can all come to Ulster University, and because it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. Northern Ireland is absolutely beautiful. It's not like you might have seen it in the TV, black and white TV footage. It's a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. It's gorgeous. So you're more than welcome.
It is in my future plans. I will visit,
Yes, great stuff. Well, I will see you soon. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and hope to see you all soon. Take care.
It was our pleasure. See you soon. Goodbye.
Take care. Thanks, Huri. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Well, that was not a bad shot, but this is not how it all started. I've always been dreaming of becoming a filmmaker. I believe that a good movie can make our world a better place. But I need to learn more. Life is like a video game. It's fun and it's challenging at the same time. Every accomplished mission leads to another one. Look at these harmonious moves. A perfect combination of mind and body, absolute freedom of self-expression. Art imitates life, and nature is the ultimate masterpiece. To design like a master, you must learn the basics and then go beyond. But how? So our journey began to this magical place, Cyprus. We found our voices. We heard each other's songs. We captured our moment, and we painted our lives. Not to mention the fun. We illuminated our future. We learned from the past. The craft and the knowledge came together to create art. there's a lot to discover and a lot to be done. We were taken by hand, one by one. The journey goes on, and the future is bright. The seeds we planted will give years of beautiful blossoms. So our dreams came to life, and life became like a dream. The magic is real, only if you believe. The journey we began finally came to an end. But it's time for a new start. Now, let's take another shot.